They say home is where the heart is. But what happens when the places we trust most turn against us? Tonight, I'll share with you 5 strange neighborhood stories. True tales of terror that will make you question if you truly know the people living next door. These aren't just stories about monsters or ghosts, no. They're about the horrifying truths hidden in plain sight. So sit back, but don't get too comfortable. After all, who knows what's lurking just outside your window? Story 1. The Hollow Child. It all started with a laugh, soft, distant, and eerily out of place. Jenna lived in a quiet, suburban neighborhood where children's laughter during the day was normal. But at midnight, that was something else entirely. She first heard it while lying in bed, scrolling through her phone. A faint giggle floated through the air, just outside her bedroom window. At first, she dismissed it. Maybe the neighbor's kids were playing late. Kids were unpredictable. The next night, it returned. This time, the laughter was louder, sharper, and accompanied by the faint sound of feet scuffing the ground. Jenna's curiosity started to tingle, but she convinced herself it was her imagination. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. By the third night, Jenna's nerves were frayed. She couldn't sleep, constantly waiting for the sound to begin. And when it finally did, closer than ever, she decided to look. Her heart pounded as she approached the window, her breath fogging the glass. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain and peered out. At first, there was nothing. Just her yard bathed in pale moonlight. But then, at the edge of the shadows, she saw it. A small figure, childlike, standing unnaturally still. It was too far to see clearly, but something about its posture was wrong. Its head tilted slightly, as if it knew she was watching. Jenna froze, torn between slamming the window shut and staring longer. But before she could move, the figure bolted. No, bolted wasn't the right word. It disappeared, moving so fast it seemed to melt into the shadows. Over the next few weeks, Jenna became obsessed. She stopped sleeping altogether, watching the yard every night. The laughter returned sporadically, sometimes farther away, sometimes closer. She told her neighbors, but none of them had children or claimed to hear anything at all. One night, she set up a camera. The next morning, she reviewed the footage. The laughter was there, but the yard was empty. Except for the moment she pulled back the curtain. In that brief second, the figure was staring directly at her window. Its face was hollow, smooth, and featureless. Jenna moved out a month later, but the laughter followed her, echoing faintly in the dead of night. Story 2. The Withers Residence. Every neighborhood has that house. You know the one. The lawn is overgrown, the windows boarded up, and rumors swirl about what happened there. For Devon's neighborhood, it was the Withers residence, a decaying husk of a home, with a story no one dared confirm. Mrs. Withers had lived there decades ago, but the rumors said she'd lost her mind after her son disappeared. Some said she buried his body in the backyard. Others whispered about strange lights in the windows, even though the house had been empty for years. One summer night, Devon and his friends decided to prove they weren't scared. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they crept through the broken gate and into the yard. The air felt heavier there, the shadows thicker. They reached the back door, which was slightly ajar. Devon pushed it open, revealing a dark hallway filled with stale, musty air. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, but it was the smell that struck them first. Something damp, earthy, almost like rot. As they moved deeper into the house, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Their flashlights flickered, though the batteries were new. When Devon swept his beam across the living room, he froze. Handprints. Dozens of them. They covered the walls, fresh and glistening, as though someone or something had just pressed against them. One of his friends screamed, and Devon turned to see a message forming on the wall, the letters smearing into existence, as if an invisible hand was writing, "Get out." The boys didn't need another warning. They ran, tripping over themselves as they fled the house. When they reached the street, they turned to look back. The windows, empty seconds ago, now glowed faintly, as though something inside was watching them leave. Devon moved away years later, but his nightmares stayed. He still dreams of handprints reaching for him in the dark. Story 3. Mr. Reynolds' Polaroids. Every neighborhood has a Mr. Reynolds, the ideal neighbor. Cheerful, helpful, and just the right mix of charming and unassuming. He was the first to greet new residents, always quick with a friendly wave and a warm, "Good morning." He brought cookies to every bake sale and even ran a small book club for the cul-de-sac. But there was something about Mr. Reynolds that you couldn't quite put your finger on. Maybe it was his tendency to stand at his front window for hours, gazing out at the street. Or the way he seemed to know a little too much about everyone. Like how Janet across the street preferred red wine on weekends. Or that the Wilsons hadn't locked their back door one Thursday night. It wasn't until the package arrived at Mrs. Collins's house that anyone started to suspect something might be wrong. It was a simple mistake. Her address was one digit off from his. The box was unmarked, sealed loosely with tape, and when she picked it up, the weight felt strange. Out of curiosity, she opened it. Inside, she found Polaroids, dozens at first glance, but as she sifted through them, it became clear there were far more, hundreds, maybe thousands. Each photo was eerily candid, taken from strange angles that made her skin crawl. Pictures of people sleeping in their beds, eating dinner, watering their plants. And the photos weren't random. They were of everyone on the block. The realization hit her like ice water. These weren't memories. They were surveillance. Someone had been watching them. Watching her. One photo, buried near the bottom of the box, showed her through her kitchen window, pouring coffee in her bathrobe. She had taken that cup to the sink just the day before. Panicked, Mrs. Collins called the police. They promised to investigate and took the package, assuring her they'd find Mr. Reynolds for questioning. But when the officers entered his house later that day, they were stunned. The furniture was gone, the walls stripped bare. There was no sign anyone had lived there for years. Dust covered every surface, save for one spot, a message scratched into the plaster above the fireplace. "I'll be watching." Some claimed Mr. Reynolds had never really been there at all, that he was just a figment of their collective imagination. Others believed he was real, but something else. Something not entirely human. The neighbors haven't seen him since, but late at night, some swear they still feel the weight of his gaze through their windows. Story 4. The Anonymous Letters. Mira's life was simple, predictable even. Her cul-de-sac was her sanctuary. Quiet, friendly, and full of neighbors who minded their own business. But that all changed when the first letter appeared. It was a plain white envelope slipped under her door. No postage, no return address. The message inside was chillingly simple. "I know what you did." At first, she thought it was a prank. Maybe one of the neighborhood kids was testing their limits. She crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash, laughing nervously. She hadn't done anything, right? The next day, another letter arrived. This one read, "Why didn't you stop him?" Mira's heart sank. She tried to convince herself it was still just a joke, but her mind wandered back to a memory she had buried deep. Years ago, she'd witnessed something terrible. Her neighbor, Mr. Harding, had been berating his son in their backyard. The shouting was so loud she couldn't ignore it, and she'd stepped outside to intervene. But the moment she opened her mouth, Mr. Harding turned and stared at her. The look in his eyes was cold, menacing, and she had quickly retreated inside, closing the curtains. A week later, the boy was gone. Sent away, they said. But Mira always wondered if that was the truth. The letters kept coming, each one more personal, more accusatory. You saw the bruises. You stayed silent. The messages sent chills through her. Who could know about that? She hadn't told a soul. She hadn't even thought about it in years. Terrified, she told her husband everything, sobbing as she recounted the memory she had buried. He tried to comfort her, telling her it wasn't her fault. But deep down, she knew the letters were right. She should have done something. The next morning, she opened her door, expecting another envelope. But the letters had stopped. Weeks passed, and life began to feel normal again. But then one night, as she lay in bed, she heard a knock on the door. Not loud, but deliberate. When she peeked through the peephole, no one was there. Only an envelope sitting on the welcome mat. She hesitated before picking it up, her hands trembling. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words scrawled in red ink. Too little, too late. Mira still lives in that house, but she hasn't slept well since. She keeps her lights on all night and never answers the door after dark. Story 5. The Park on Primrose Lane. Primrose Lane had a charm to it, with its cobblestone streets and quaint neighborhood park. It was the kind of place where parents felt safe letting their kids play outside until dusk. But when the sun went down, the park became something else entirely. Locals whispered about strange happenings, shadowy figures near the swings, the feeling of being watched. But Lisa didn't believe in ghost stories. The park was part of her nightly jogging route, and she wasn't about to change her routine over rumors. One warm summer evening, as the sky turned orange, Lisa tied her running shoes and set out. By the time she reached the park, twilight had settled. The air was still, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. She was halfway through the park when her music cut out. The sudden silence was jarring, and for a moment, she thought her headphones had died. But then, she heard it. The faint, rhythmic creak of a swing. Lisa stopped, glancing toward the swing set. It was empty, or so it seemed at first. But then she noticed one swing moving, slow and deliberate, as though someone had just been sitting there. She took a cautious step closer, her breath hitching. There was no breeze, no reason for the swing to move on its own. And that's when she saw them. Footprints appearing in the dirt beneath the swing, one after the other, heading straight toward her. Panic set in, and Lisa turned to run. But no matter how far she went, she felt like something was just behind her. The swing's creak followed her, faint and persistent. When she finally reached her house, she locked the door and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. But as she sat there in the dark, she heard it again. The unmistakable creak of a swing, carried on the wind, as if it had followed her home. Lisa changed her jogging route after that. She never returned to the park, but sometimes, late at night, she swears she hears that sound.